Oh, no, sod it. I'll let it go. Hello and everybody, and welcome back to Conversations with a Coach podcast. This is the first podcast I am recording in 2023. Previously, I've got a bank of podcasts that are unpublished that I will be releasing, but the first 2023 podcast. And I would like to welcome my guest today, who is known on Instagram as @BobbyNutrition. Bobby, do you want to introduce yourself and tell me a little bit about who is Bobby Nutrition?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
I am really excited. Because I know that your style of conversation is very honest, right?
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it. Who is Bobby Nutrition? Well, Rob, Bobby, people go by both. From a business perspective, what we do, well, we help ladies and a few men. I think we have 2 poor men in the moment who know they're very outnumbered in the program. But predominantly we help ladies who have finally realized that the preoccupation mentally with weight loss is actually coming from a relatively toxic place. That doesn't mean we're against weight loss per se. Intentional weight loss, maybe. It depends on where it's coming from. We focus more on what I would say unintentional weight loss, if weight loss even comes into the conversation. What we really focus on is that relationship with the self and the relationship with the body, and the relationship with food. And then that can go all the way back to trauma, trying to connect the dots, helping people understand themselves better. And I think the second way of answering this question is, who am I? I think what I've come to realize recently is that whilst, yes, I am Bobby Nutrition, the emotional eating guy, but really, I actually see what I love doing is actually just helping people to understand themselves in a way that they never really have before. So I'm not sure what that holds for the future, but it just so happens that I've always been obsessed with evidence-based nutrition. So it seemed like a really natural segue. It happened by accident, really, So really, emotional eating is just the coping mechanism that we happen to be really, really good at helping with. What I really, really love doing, and what I see my purpose as being, is helping people understand themselves finally.
Yeah. Why do you think you're so good at that?
I think one big reason is that I didn't. And that's, maybe I'm biased towards this, but I think that's what really helped me, once, dare I say, it's a relatively logical way of looking at it. But once I understood why I was making these really sabotaging, ridiculous choices in life, which from yourself and from everyone around you, there's always judgments and there's always elements of shame because they're stupid, at least on the surface. Well, what do you then do when you feel shame? You use the very thing to cope with the shame that you're trying to get rid of, and it goes round in a cycle. So what helped me was finally looking at myself from a value-driven perspective, because values is a word that's thrown around all the time now, right? Yeah. Self-growth, every fucker's doing it. Sorry, am I allowed to swear on this?
Yeah, you can swear. It's my podcast.
Too late. Your husband can get it out later. But at that point, it really wasn't. I'm a really cynical person at heart. Not so much these days, but I was brought up by a cynic, and I was always proud of my cynicism. I think most cynics are.
Yeah.
And I was very analytical. I was very logical about anything. If it wasn't logical, at least on the surface of things, you're an idiot.
Yeah.
How dare you believe in something, But once I started to read more about our unconscious and where values come from, And then I started to then pick apart what my values were that were driving me, good values and bad values. It helped relinquish some of the responsibility. Now, you have to still take responsibility, of course, but once I started realizing that a lot of what we do is driven unconsciously, well, that's exactly what I can apply to everyone else then. So, and it's the same with the coaches as well, with the team. One of the things that I'll always say to people coming on board is that we don't, unless you've experienced relatively quote unquote significant trauma yourself, we won't bring you in as a coach, because for me, you just won't fully get it. You will theoretically, and your intention could be absolutely great. But when push comes to shove, you need to have been in similar shoes. Not necessarily, it doesn't have to be that you've used the same coping mechanism, because I'm not an emotional eater, at least how we'd label it anyway. I think we're all emotional eaters to some extent, but at least have a problem with emotional eating, you know. But because I was very much in the shoes of very misunderstood, put into a world that wanted me to do things a certain way, that really it wasn't right for me. And then you stop trusting yourself, you know? So having gone through all of that up until I was about 25, 26 and the light bulb went off, that's why I think I'm very good at articulating things as well.
Yeah.
But I think there's no point, you know, it's annoying when somebody is articulate, but they're an arsehole, right?
Yeah, we see that a lot.
Yeah. But I like to think that having been there in some way or another, I can resonate.
Yeah, and I think it's really important when you're dealing with such deep issues and such an emotional response, having that resonating relatability is key to building a relationship with your client, right? You can't get the best out of somebody if they aren't fully invested in the relationship and they don't trust you. And I think that when it comes to trauma, either big trauma or little trauma, if you can talk to somebody that has been through similar, there is that natural affinity, because it's almost like they won't judge me because they know how this feels.
100%. Yeah. For right or wrong, you know, because the argument then on the other side is, you know, you shouldn't care what people think. But when we meet people at this point, of course they bloody do.
Yeah.
You know, they're always going to feel judged. They're always going to have a lack of trust in people. I think every single lady that I jump on the phone with for the first time, I had this conversation yesterday. And I said to her, look, I shoot from the hip and I seem to get away with it. I think I can do it in a nice, compassionate way. But there is a barrier up and you need to tell me what it is. Like, what do you think it is? And what we got to is the fact that she's just been fucked over left, right and centre by not every coaching program imaginable, but every person in her life as well.
Yeah.
So it's, if you've just built up this catalogue of evidence that you cannot trust people, it defies human psychology for you to think otherwise. You know, you are not going to trust people, and that's perfectly fine, at least for the time being.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I really get what you're saying with that, because it might surprise some people listening to this podcast that I say this, but I've always been the sort of person that says, I don't give a shit what anybody else thinks. I don't care what anybody else thinks. It's a fucking huge lie.
Right.
I really care too much, probably, what other people think about me, because of various life experiences, because of undiagnosed ADHD and autism, because of masking and spending my entire life not realizing that in order to protect myself, I was incredibly defensive. People that know me really well will know that I can be defensive and prickly.
It doesn't come across.
It can sometimes. Like if you've followed me for a while on social media and you watch my stories, you can tell when I'm in a funk because I get very, very kind of ragey about certain topics. And then you can see that like defense kind of thing coming out. But when we've been hurt, when we've been shamed, when we feel judgment, our automatic response is to protect ourselves and to either create a harsh exterior where we don't let anybody in, like a snail with a shell or a tortoise with a shell. We retreat back into that shell so nobody can get to us, or we attack and we lash out and we do things. And sometimes that can take the form of self-abuse, right? That in order to protect ourselves, we can make ourselves unattractive or we can make ourselves aggressive in order to stop people approaching us or getting close to us. And do you think that with emotional eating, explain to me a little bit about what emotional eating looks like, because I don't want people to confuse this with eating disorders. There is a difference and a nuance here between disordered eating, eating disorders, emotional eating, isn't there? Can you explain some of the differences there?
Yeah, so I think the word that you see thrown around a lot is binge eating, right? And what people actually mean is overeating a lot of the time. And there is a subtle difference. And the difference really is that with binge eating, it is a complete lack of control. And the very idea of not being able to have this food right now, it sends your nervous system into a complete sense of disarray.
Yeah.
That's where we start to enter the realms of an eating disorder. Whereas disordered eating is, I would say, more common. And this is where it is less severe. But it's still problematic in the sense that it takes the form of a coping mechanism. So it is a blurred line, which is why, we would always have to ask, have you been diagnosed with an eating disorder?
Yeah.
Because it's not up to me. It's up to the doc. So yeah, there is a difference. And I think many coaches, there's a problem in this industry at the moment where people, for all good intention perhaps, are helping people because maybe they've had binge eating disorder, for example, and they think that that means that they can help. Now, this is where my opinion is somewhat controversial, because my opinion is the following: is that if you've got the skills, you've got the skills. The qualifications are just a piece of paper. They're not just a piece of paper, sorry, but there are, whether it be psychologists or registered dietitians. So registered dietitians are who, on paper, you could send somebody with an eating disorder to. I personally know registered dietitians that I wouldn't send any of my clients within a mile of. Right?
Yeah.
So it does come down to your empathy skills and what have you as well. Yeah, there is a big problem in this industry at the moment with I think people maybe unintentionally, without realizing that they may be out of their depth.
Yeah, and that's harmful, right? Because that's doing way more harm than good with the right intention, but it's still, drifting way out of the lane that scope of practice would fall under. So how would somebody with an emotional eating as a coping strategy, how do you overcome that? How do you help people? What do you do? What voodoo do you practice?
Yeah, I get this question all the time. And I love it in a podcast format. But when people ask it me on like TikTok and Instagram, I'm like, are you joking? Do you really expect me to answer that question in a fucking comment? And to digress slightly, so if I do, I always will. But feel free to bring me back to actually answering the question. But I think what I want a lot of people to take from this as well is that if you find yourself asking that question, of course, it's perfect for this scenario. But if you find yourself as somebody struggling asking that question, it's the wrong question if you're struggling with something, because I consider myself relatively, I can read between the lines quite well.
Yeah. Intuitive.
And typically that means that you're just looking for another fix. What's the trick?
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, friend, it's not going to be something I can just slap a label onto a product for. But to answer your question, it's I think step one for me, this is where I think as coaches in the program, we differ as well. This is my perspective.
Yeah.
So for me, what I find works is step one is logically connecting the dots by understanding why you make the choices that you do. And that is having a theoretical knowledge of trauma, I suppose. So what I will often do in a first conversation with a prospective student is help them through that process.
Yeah.
And that can be, it's looking at their story at the same time as applying, let's say, well, this is why you're nervous. Well, your nervous system is doing this, and neurologically, your mind is doing this. And I think when you slap a bit of that onto it as well, whilst it is somewhat more clinical, it helps them realize that they're not this messy, stupid idiot, right? Well, first of all, we're all messy, stupid idiots.
Yeah.
All of us nobody's perfect. We're human. So when you help people realize that it's not their fault, that's extremely powerful. Where people can misconstrue that is, and this is where the cynics of the world can come into the conversation and say, well, you're just relinquishing responsibility then. No, you have to keep on taking responsibility. But if you can't understand what from your past is driving you to make the decisions that you are, the only other option left is to judge and shame yourself for it, because that's what society does. So you're going to internalize that as well.
Yeah.
So step one is helping them understand logically X caused Y.
Yeah.
And then it's stepping into what all of that then brings, because then it's a case of inner child work, for example, where we can look at, let's say I've helped you realize that the reason, let's try and play it out in terms of how I'd have the conversation. So what would happen is the person would open up and we talk about mum, we talk about dad. And what we often find is that this person grew up in an environment where mum, and I'm not even about food. It's food comes into it, but more often than not, it's this more general ideology that appearances matter, sure, but other people's opinions matter. We've got to keep up appearances in this household.
Yeah.
Well, the message that the child then receives, depending on their age, is that, oh, I'm not enough as I am.
Yeah.
You know, child's mind is stupid, as Dr. Gabor Mate refers to children as narcissists.
Yeah, they're self-centered. That's all they care about.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. They're kids.
Exactly.
They don't give a shit about us.
Yeah. Cats.
Yeah.
And but that's just how the child's mind works. So then it happens again, and happens again, and it happens again. And what we've got to remember is that mum and dad, they're the psychological representation of two things. One, God, but two, everybody that you're ever going to come into contact with for the rest of your life.
Yeah,
you know?
so dad true.
This, I'm going to think this. My story with that is my dad had a very bad temper, still does, a bad temper in the car, right? So that's all I was exposed to. So when I see him screaming at people for doing what I would consider very reasonable maneuvers on the road, right? It's teaching me that this is how everyone thinks.
Yeah.
How do you think my first driving test went?
Oh, yeah.
This is what I'm thinking. I'm not just managing myself. I'm now having to manage what everyone else is thinking about me.
Yeah.
which is an impossible task. It's completely outside of our control. So to bring it back to the example, it creates this sense of uncertainty in the individual. So then we can say, well, all right, Sandra, for example. So if I was to ask you now how you feel when stepping outside, let's say you're going for a meal with your friends, what happens in your mind before you go to that meal? Well, I've got to think about getting the perfect dress, and I've got to do this, I've got to do that. Well, how do you feel when that is happening? Well, I'm stressed, I'm anxious. How did you feel if you can take it back to what that little girl was feeling? Is there a difference? And the light bulb goes off.
Yeah.
I've got goose pimples. I get emotional about this. When they can see for the first time that nothing's changed. They're still the same little girl.
Yeah.
And when people realize that for the first time, and they realize the reason that I feel this it's not because I'm weak, or because I lack motivation, or because I lack strength. All of those things are conscious. They're for the prefrontal cortex. They're for the conscious side of our mind. We choose to be strong. And that's why motivation is fleeting.
Yeah.
Because what really drives us in the end is the 95% mind, which is where all of that other stuff is kept. And once they finally realize that at an intellectual level, well, that then helps, I find at least, the emotional side of them to then buy into it and then just do more and more and more and more and more.
Yeah. It's so interesting, because a lot of work that I do with clients tends to come from, whenever it's an insecurity or a limiting belief, it can be traced right back to like pre-7 years old, with that imprint stage and that's where we learn about who we are and our place in the world before the age of 7. Yeah. And when you think about it as a parent and you look back, I didn't learn all of this stuff until my kids were past 7. And then I was like, where have I fucked them up? Let's unpick some of this. And I often find myself remembering an incident and apologising retrospectively. I remember when I did this and I shouted at you and I shouldn't have done, and I'm really sorry. And my kids go, what the fuck are you talking about? I don't remember that. I don't remember it happening that way. And I'm like, okay, yeah, no, we're good here. That's fine. But that key stage, and we hold this internal unconscious representation of who we are and how other people see us. And quite often that 7-year-old version of ourselves is not who we truly are or how other people see us. It's just that story that we've told ourselves all the way through our life. Mm-hmm. And when you just said you got goosebumps, I got goosebumps as well, because I know that even when I do it, when I get a flashback of something that happened when I was younger, or I remember a time where I felt so-and-so about myself, and then I just want to go back and hug little me and go, shit, like little me, like that must have been heartbreaking. But I can recognize that I was a child and that wasn't how it was viewed as an adult. Mm-hmm. And sometimes what I find with some of my clients and some of the things that I read and discuss is that people can then sometimes blame their parents for this. And then that internal feeling then becomes projected onto something else rather than healing. So it's almost like another destructive circle of a bad relationship. So it's, oh, my parents didn't do this, so therefore my parents were rubbish or shit. And it's so important to recognize that we're all just doing the best that we can. I can't remember who says it exactly, but I hear this parroted all the time. And it's so true that we do the best that we can with the tools and resources that we have at that time and place. If we truly believe that everybody is just always doing their very best, the world becomes a much nicer place. Yeah, it really does. Yeah. I tend to forget that when I'm in a car. Like I just resonated with your dad there. I am dreadful in my car. My road rage is awful. But I think that's also in part due to my ADHD and lack of patience and not liking to be still. But yeah, just coming back to where we were, that reparenting and that recognizing that inner child part of you needs healing and needs understanding and needs nurturing again. And when we can recognize that, particularly as women, because we have this maternal instinct,
Sure.
it becomes such strong, powerful work. Such strong, powerful work. So when it comes to the emotional eating and they start to see that that's how they've been coping and they've been comforting themselves with food, and they start to move forward, what does that then start to manifest in their life? How do they then start to react, and what are the behaviours as people start to heal? What do you see in your work?
That's a really good question. It's a sense of peace. I don't like that answer though, because it's very ambiguous. I think Rose, right? You know, Rose very well.
Rose, yeah.
So we call Rose Cupid for a reason. Because, and for those listening, Rose is one of the Bobby Nutrition coaches. She has helped numerous women. Now, we're not a dating agency, right? So let me just put that out there. But it's not about food, and it never was.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they find out, and they realize that the people pleasing, the perfectionism, the idea that they have to be everywhere for everyone, they have to manage everybody else's emotions before they manage their own. Because if they manage other people's emotions, well, because they were taught that to receive love is conditional, they've been giving their entire lives in the hope of actually receiving that love in return.
Yeah.
Once they finally realize that, again, at a logical level, they can call themselves out on it.
Yeah.
They can call that emotional brain out for the bullshit that it's feeding them. And when they start doing that, well, then it doesn't change the emotions. It doesn't mean I'm not going to be scared of this situation anymore.
Yeah.
So there's still an element of fear that they have to overcome by facing the fear head on, whether that be a practical fear, well, fear is emotional, but whether it be a practical situation or something that's just living right up here and nothing is happening externally. Doesn't matter. So a first date, for example, is terrifying when all of the evidence that you have unconsciously and emotionally tells you that men are shit. Every man that you have been with has been an arsehole, you know? So why would you believe anything different? It's not a lot. That churning you get in your stomach of going on a first date, then it's not logical. You don't choose that as a defense mechanism. It's all happening unconsciously.
Yeah.
So there comes a point where we then have to say, we understand this part now. Now it's time to step into it, bit by bit, baby steps. And so to come back to the point of dating, then all of these traits that we actually find are just feeding into the coping mechanism of food actually you've been coping with it in many other ways. You've been avoiding life.
Yeah.
You've been distracting yourself. Food is just one thing that you've probably been using. It's just the obvious one because society has a very strong opinion on what happens if you consume too much food.
Yeah.
So then once we realize that there are other elements of life, such as work and relationships, that you can step into somewhat differently, to come back to the point of Rose, we had one client, lovely lady, Antonella, who is, out into the big bad world now. She left us 4 or 5 months ago, something like that. And she sent Rose a message not too long ago saying, not only because she had a severe lack of trust in men, justifiably, not only did she step into the dating pool, she feels she's found the love of her life.
Oh.
And she realized that the job that she had, which was a relatively, so-called high power job, she realized that the only reason that she was doing it, surrounding herself with all of these alpha males, was to try to prove something.
Of course.
To overcome this lack that she was feeling to begin with.
Yeah.
Once she realized that there isn't a lack and she's a fucking phenomenal human as it is, well, she left that behind because she didn't have to prove anything to anyone or herself. And she started her own company, which is flourishing.
Amazing. I love stuff like that. That is just everything. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And the food is just the one part that I guess becomes the friction point for them to start to heal. And we all have that one friction point, that one thing that we just can't tolerate any more of.
Right.
That moves us towards taking action. And nearly always surprises people, and it did me, that when you start to heal and you start to work on yourself, the thing that you think is wrong with you is not the thing that you think is wrong with you. And when you're presented with the actual thing that is wrong with you, you kind of go, bollocks. Yeah, bollocks. Yeah. And some people can like completely shut down and decide, this is not for me. I am not ready to do that, and carry on as they were. Or they throw themselves fully into this. And I have found that self-development has been probably the most freeing, amazing, but also the most painful, hurtful, sad journey that I have been on. And I think that's what sometimes stops people getting the help and support that they need, is that they know subconsciously that it's going to hurt in some way.
Yes.
So, and they're not prepared for that, so they never want to step into it.
And also, there's that 100%. So I think a lot of the time before people come to us, people come to us at different points along this journey. But most of them are at that point where they know something has to be done. They know something deeper is up.
Yeah.
But dare I say it, that's almost the easier part, because once you feel like you've overcome that fear, you think you've done that. You think you've done the hard part. And then what you come to realize is that your brain's a funny thing. Your nervous system's a funny thing. And if you have done things in a specific way, I think the average age of our lady is probably anywhere between 40 to 45, give or take. So we're talking 10, 20, 30, 40 years and more in many cases, of every second of every day. What's the data telling us? That we have something like 70,000 thoughts per day.
Yeah.
I don't know how they measure that, but most of which being negative.
Yeah.
So whatever that figure is for how long you've been on this earth, that's a lot of thinking the same way.
Yeah.
You know, and we are just machines in the end. So your neurons are firing in a very specific way. So even if the firing of those neurons in this specific way is bringing you misery, it doesn't matter, because they fire in this way. It's what's comfortable, even if it's chaos. The biggest psychological travesty of human existence for me is that if you were brought up in absolute chaos as an adult, not only will you accept that chaos, but you will actively seek it out.
Yeah. Actively
sabotage yourself to align to the chaos or the limiting beliefs that you have been surrounded with the entirety of your life. So what happens is you're a couple of months in and you're nailing it. Everything's going well. You're excited. You're motivated. And then all of a sudden, the brain starts feeding back saying, "Ooh, yeah, but we used to do things the other way."
Yeah, it's like a factory reset.
Yeah, exactly. And it comes up in really ugly ways. Horrible messages, horrible self-talk. And that's the most dangerous point, I think, in someone's journey in terms of letting it go, because they think they've gotten over the hurdle when really the hurdle is yet to come.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think of how this displayed itself with myself. I think for me it was starting the business. Mm-hmm. And I thought I knew it all, and I thought I'd done all of my self-growth stuff at this point. We're going back about 3 years ago, something like that. And I'd left the corporate job. I was doing this. Everything was relatively comfortable, ish, finances were okay. But I think at one point I changed something in the business and all of a sudden things didn't feel okay. I think maybe on the surface, everything was absolutely fine, but internally, I almost threw it all away.
Yeah.
I remember to this day going to New Brighton Front and Jess was like, "We need to go out. We have to get you out, because all of the old stories, you're not good enough." And it all came back. I remember it like it was yesterday. And it is just a story. Your feelings are valid, but they are just feelings. That's the tricky part.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've been there, and it takes a Herculean effort, an exhausting effort on a daily basis to just exist when
Right.
you feel that way. And on the outside, you look fairly normal, a bit tired. But internally, yeah, the chaos can be absolutely, utterly exhausting. So how do you know, Bobby, that you're doing a good job with your clients? How do you know?
Well, I suppose I can give emotional answers or I can give technical answers. We've got the typical check-in forms and what have you. We measure it. We're very data-driven, and we have formulas that tell us, if everyone's happy and what have you. But the way that we know, first and foremost, is that we don't take too many people on, and that it means that our coaches can have a very, 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 very close relationship with the individuals that they're working with, so they can make a nuanced decision as to, is this person okay?
Yeah.
So in terms of that's at least how I can understand it. So at a top level, I can get that feedback from my coaches. But I think what you're asking is, what's the person doing that's actually showing you that everything's okay? It's not too dissimilar to the previous answer. It's when it depends on where they are.
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody comes to me 3 months in and they are like I just described,
Yeah.
I'll be like, perfect, right on cue. Whereas to them, they're like, you're mental. They're like dying inside.
Yeah.
And, they're like, I'm going to quit my job. You're an asshole, all this.
Yeah.
And really, this is why it's important to have gone through. You can't read about the stuff that I'm talking about now. So I think for the first couple of months, people are motivated and they're learning something new for the first time, but then they realize so-called progress is potentially slowing down. And then, like clockwork, something really comes to a head 3 or 4 months in. Not all the time, but more often than you would think.
Yeah.
And this is just those stories coming back. And then we get through that together. We get through it. And then the final procedure, I call it creating a new identity.
Mm-hmm.
Because the way that I try to think of it in my mind is, well, where are you now? Where's the starting point? The center and the bulk of it is, how can we help you understand yourself better? So we go through that process. And then the final part is, how can we actually create a new identity? Because that's the part that people, and it sounds really woolly, and I'm not a woo-woo guy. I'm not. I'm quite a sequential person. But so creating a new identity is you've done the logical part, somewhat of the emotional side as well. You've had to step into, whether it's reparenting or inner child work, whatever it might be. But when it comes to creating a new identity, that means that thinking about things isn't enough anymore.
Yeah.
You've got to do. There's some things that, as a mentor once told me, you can't outthink a doing problem.
Yeah.
Problem that needs doing. And one of the issues that I ran into for a huge chunk of my self-development journey, being an analytical person, was I was great at journaling. I could articulate my emotions back to you better than any psychiatrist or psychologist could.
Yeah.
But that will only take you so far. You have to really feel everything that you're trying to feel.
Yeah.
And that's where the creating a new identity starts. So once people start acknowledging that fear and sadness and pain is not a you thing. It's not something to be ashamed of. It's a human condition.
Yeah.
It's information. It's information that's coming from. It's trying to tell you something.
Yeah, it's your internal sat nav, right? An emotion is
a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. And once people are accepting of that, and again, coming back to what we said before, what's the secret, right? There isn't one. You don't overcome this stuff, at least in the sense that you initially consider overcoming.
Yeah.
It's just a state of acceptance. And then once you can accept things, then when things aren't going so well, internally at least, it's just a blip.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the measurement for me, I think. Being okay. I think Mark Manson, my literary hero, he puts it great. It's that life is not about removing all of these problems. It's about identifying the problems that are worth for you feeling shit for.
Yeah. That's a really great way to look at it, because life has a habit of kicking you in the pants regularly. It's choose your battles. It's like when you're raising kids. Kids are going to be little shits sometimes. And if you constantly shout at them for being little shits and exploring and doing things that are not socially acceptable, you're going to find yourself constantly being annoyed, irritated, cross, or disappointed. Because that's how kids learn, is by doing lots of things that they're not supposed to do. Because
and that's tough, right? Because that's where I really struggle personally, because I've got a step boy, Louis, and he's 8. That wonderful 8. He's about to turn 9 next week. I think it's next week or the week after. And that's hard, man, because I see so much of myself in him. Yeah. What he's trying to get away with, what he's trying to sneak, any of the manipulation. And, and these are such on the surface toxic negative traits, but this is what children are. They're narcissists,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
it's so difficult to let them just be sometimes. And I know I've got it wrong. I still do. And I think the thing that I really borderline resent the self-development process for is how much you do intellectualize things.
Yeah.
And then, God, like you alluded to earlier, when you start apologizing for things that you did years ago with your kids, like I find myself doing the same thing. It's torturous. Yeah,
it really is. And my stepson is the same. He's literally just turned 9. So that phase I am very familiar with. My 2 children, so my son will be 22 this year. My daughter's 17 this year. They seem to be fairly okay. So I've raised children to a level of socially acceptable and seem to be fairly independent and okay. And now I have 2 stepchildren who are 9 and nearly 7. So I get to fuck 2 more up. Because even the lessons that I learned with my 2, when you're presented with 2 different ones, like, they don't respond the same. They're completely different. They're individuals. So you can raise many children in the same household and they will all come out in different ways. And I find that utterly fascinating, that how a tiny circumstantial environmental change can impact how somebody turns out or how somebody perceives the world. Or,
when you say circumstance, do you mean like a specific incident, or do you mean the general environment?
That something can be insignificant as an adult, such as a new teacher.
Right, yes.
But the child being in a classroom and something happens with that teacher on the first day and it colours their experience of that school year. And then that school year colours their experience of school.
So depressing, isn't it?
It is, but it's fascinating because it makes you aware that as a child, if that can happen, as an adult, you can recognise where you might have inherited certain perceptions and ideas and beliefs and values from. And if that was something that you chose or you didn't choose to inherit, it was just part, you can unchoose to do that. It's almost like it's not as simple as click your fingers and right. I don't believe that anymore. But recognizing that, oh shit, that happened because of that. And I had an immature mind, so I didn't see it in the way that it was intended or not intended. You can reframe situations and make peace with them.
Yeah.
But then you look at it on the flip side and you go, right, and you start to, this is my issue with self-development and understanding how people's minds work. I then analyse everybody around me. I then start to unpick, and I think I'm quite naturally intuitive, and I'll have a conversation with somebody. And because I found this is just how my brain works as a neurodivergent person, I don't do small talk. I fucking get so irritated by small talk. I don't want to know. I don't want to know about what dress you wore last week or what shoes. I want to know, how did your mum fuck you up as a kid? Give me that stuff. Yeah, get into the deepness. And now I understand why people have always said to me, fucking hell, you're intense.
Yeah.
You're yeah. And why people are drawn to me in like nightclub toilets, you know, the deep and meaningfuls that you get in kitchens at parties. Like I'd be in the middle of all of that going, oh, let me sort that. Yeah, that's just, and but I love that. Yeah. But I love that. And I found that that's why I love coaching, because I'm not afraid to ask the questions that need to be asked.
That's really true, actually. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, but understanding that the intellectual side of there has to be consent with this, like as an adult and somebody that's explored this and cocked it up many, many times, understanding that, do you mind if I ask you such and such, or I can see that you're feeling this particular way. Is it okay to explore that, and kind of getting that consent as a coach? I don't do that with my kids. Like, it's my right as a parent to override all of that shit.
Yeah.
But you mentioned that you have coaches that work with you under Bobby Nutrition. What criteria? I know you mentioned that it's part of the almost philosophy that they need to have experienced some level of trauma or upset for them to be able to resonate. But what other criteria do your coaches have that make them good enough or perfect for Bobby Nutrition?
There's certain qualifications, but again, I have a certain opinion of that, and I like to make a judgment on what the person can actually do as opposed to what the paper says. So we recently did a workshop, and my team's going to kill me for this, but I'm going to try and remember what our core values are, or at least some of them, and that's what they need to live to, right? Yeah. So, and some of them are quite silly. So, for example, one of them, I'm not sure if we changed this, but it's something along the lines of bubbliness. You know, if you come in and you can have all the intellect towards this as you like, love, but if you're just like about it all, our clients aren't going to resonate with you.
Yeah, yeah.
You know? So there's relatively cheeky, quirky, personality-driven sides of it, which are so important to me. So you've got to have a bit of banter. You've got to be a human about things. You've got to have a sense of humor. You have to get it done as well. So I think we labeled that as get shit done. Yeah. I would argue maybe that's more on the internal side of the business. But, you know, if you are leaving a client for more than a couple of days without a response, first of all, there needs to be a reason for that, but you need to get shit done. Yeah. There's a reason that we limit how many people you can work with, so you can actually dedicate all of your conscious effort towards them. So I'd say that overall, what else is important to me? I think they have, well, it kind of underlines everything that we started off talking about, but they've got to have that empathy. Yeah. You know, I didn't say that because I think it goes without saying, but just to re-emphasize, and empathy again is another word that's thrown around a lot.
I don't think a lot of people understand the difference between empathy, sympathy, compassion.
Just about to say, 100%. Yeah. Because what attracts a lot of people to me is what I don't want them to be attracted to me for. So because I sit in this so-called compassionate space, people think that I'm just going to blow smoke up their arse the whole time. You know,
it's okay. It's okay. Don't worry.
And whilst of course there's a certain way, depending on how somebody's mental state is, there's a certain way of delivering the message. Of course there is.
Yeah.
And I personally, and I get this probably answers the question, having that balance is really important. Yeah. So that's probably the best way to answer the question, I think, actually. I didn't even realize that balance is what's important, because if you are on the soft side, it's first of all, that'll wind me up.
Yeah.
Right. But also it's not in the client's best interests.
No.
It is in the given moment, but it's not for the future version of themselves. So you've got to be able to find that balance. That's what I would say. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what I would say sympathy is, which is just, oh, it's so tough. I understand. But that's what you speak to Meg about when you go out for a drink. She'll just stroke your ego and tell you that everything's okay when it isn't.
Yeah.
What we're here to do is to help you understand why you feel the way that you do, legitimately, not just to make you feel better about yourself, but psychologically, this is the reason you feel this way, but this is what you've got to do about it now. So I think finding that balance is absolutely fundamental.
Definitely. There's a lot of coaches that, in the online space, I see coaches talking about empathy, but their behavior displays pity rather than empathy.
Right. Yes.
And that is a negative kind of emotional response as a coach, I find. But I think it's Brené Brown, my God, my saviour, my mentor.
Yeah, she's phenomenal.
She says that empathy without boundaries is dangerous. You cannot have empathy if you don't have boundaries. You cannot have compassion if you don't have boundaries, because what that does then, if you're compassionate with no boundaries, if you're constantly helping other people, you're a people pleaser, and it's a self-destructive mechanism. And empathy is the same. Like, empathy has to have boundaries. You have to have that arm around the shoulder, kick up the butt, because yes, your situation is this. It isn't your fault. However, you can take action to move forward. I'm going to help you do that. And sympathy, I think, I don't like sympathetic responses because it seems insincere. And I don't know whether that's just my personal take on an experience on it. But like you just said, Meg in the toilet, who's going, oh, there. Don't worry about it. Like, it's okay. She don't give a shit. She's just trying to shut you up.
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
She's just trying to shut you up. Oh, it doesn't matter. Honestly, babe, blah, blah. Yeah, shut up. Let's just carry on drinking, sort of thing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
But yeah, I think empathy, balance like that, as a coach has to come into play. It really does. Otherwise, you're effectively just a trainer.
Yeah, you're just
or a teacher.
Yeah. I think I struggle with this at the moment, especially from a content perspective, because if I think about it, just being vulnerable for a second, if we're talking about this, if those people are attracted to me, it could be because that's what I'm portraying, you know, and it's not what I want to portray. It's difficult when you've got 40 seconds to do a bloody, you know, but it's what we actually value is a balance of the two. It can't be one-sided, which maybe when I'm on the content side, you know, I do, and it's all genuine. It is all genuine, but
I do think you have a balance. I think it comes across in your content. Otherwise, I would never have reached out to you.
Okay, cool. Ego stroke. I'm off.
Yeah, but it does, because I think there's certain things that you post and you say this might seem controversial, and it's you delivering that element of responsibility needs to happen here.
I hope so. But even if that weren't to come across internally, which I think is what's most important, internally within the business, it's non-negotiable for us. It's otherwise, that's why people end up coming to us, because they've had people with all of the best intentions, you know, help them. But there's a reason you don't ask your mum and dad for help with this stuff. You know, they've got the best intentions, but it's a fucking nightmare. Yeah. You know, you've got to have the balance.
Yeah, absolutely, because your parents can't be subjective or objective. I get the two of those mixed up, subjective and objective. So I use them.
Like, it is what it is. Subjective is up to interpretation.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I'll still get them wrong. Like effect and affect. I always get those two mixed up. And I find myself going, is it affect or is it an effect? And I just, yeah. Anyway, that's my grammatical rant there. Sorry. I really appreciate your time today, Bobby. I have really enjoyed our chat. Yeah. This could go on for hours and hours, but I try to keep my episodes under an hour. Yeah, I'd really like to do this again. Definitely, for sure. Where can people find you, and where can they learn more about the work that you do?
Cool. So I would say I answer it the same way. Come and talk to me. And where can you talk to me? The best place is Instagram. I'm in there all the time. It's my life. You know, I want to go to TikTok, but it sounds like that's going to shit now.
Yeah.
So go to TikTok if you want, but I'm not sure how much longer it's going to be there. So my attention from a content perspective and also from an engagement perspective, if you really want to get the most out of me, just message me, man. I think people have this impression that they're not going to answer. I've got nothing else to do. So feel free, message me and you will get a response.
Perfect. I will put the link to your Instagram in the show notes for everybody. I appreciate your time, Bobby. Really enjoyed this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.